Of all the plagues that afflict the Egyptians, the worst by far has got to be the last one.
Indeed.
It's the firstborn son of all the Egyptians. What kind of God would ask for a thing like that?
I think that today, probably more so than ever, this is I think it's a real moral struggle, especially for those people who celebrate Passover and celebrate annually the death of the firstborn. I think it's a very difficult thing to get around. Our view of God as typically a rather loving God, right? A God who protects the innocent.
Yeah.
Is really deeply challenged by a story in which, an entire class of people, the firstborn, from infants to adults, are killed.
This raises an issue that can come up again in the laws, actually, where there is a law that could be read as possibly asking for the sacrifice of the firstborn. Mm-hmm. And this comes up in the context of demanding a sacrifice of the first fruits.
Right.
That the first fruits of everything you give to God.
Right.
And the first fruits of the animals you give to God. And in Exodus 21, then the first fruits of the human womb.
That's right.
You also give to God.
Right.
However you do it.
There is and I don't think we can avoid it. There is in the background of Israelite religion and ancient Near Eastern religion in general, there is some memory of child sacrifice, some notion of it as a thing that actually did happen. Maybe not often, but it seems to be part of what's in mind here.
In the famous story in Genesis 22, he pulls back at the last minute.
That's right.
And kind of lets you off the hook on that one.
That's right.
But nonetheless, Abraham is praised for being willing to go through with it.
And later on in Judges, when Jephthah has vowed to sacrifice his daughter accidentally.
Well, of course, it was a daughter in that case.
Fair enough, but God doesn't stop him.
God doesn't stop him,
that's right. The sacrifice goes through.
And you hear of other scattered examples of human sacrifice, and you have a famous passage in the prophet Micah where a person asks, is that what I should do? Should I offer my firstborn for the sin of my soul?
There's the moment in the book of Kings when Israel is fighting against Moab, and the Moabite king is said to have sacrificed, done some child sacrifice, and it works, right? The Israelite army is sort of pushed back as a result of this. So the existence of, and in fact the utility of child sacrifice seems to have been known in the background.
Yeah. Why would people believe a thing like that? Why would people think that God would be pleased by a sacrifice? Well, by getting the first fruits of anything, and even by a human sacrifice of a child. But this one actually cuts rather deep in Christianity.
So would you?
Because
what would you say?
It seems to me that underlying this is the sense that life is not our own. Incidentally, I would say it pretty well undercuts any idea of a right to life in the Bible. Now, because you don't have rights to anything much in the Bible. This isn't the discourse that you have in the Bible. But certainly not a right to life, because the idea is that life is God's, and that this is a way of acknowledging it. Now, I think at a fairly early point in the Hebrew Bible, they realized that this is a rather extreme way of acknowledging it, at least when human children are involved. But they do continue with animal sacrifice.
They do.
As long as they had a temple to do it in.
Right. I mean, you can really see the Bible struggling with keeping the notion of first fruits broadly as belonging to God, and then saying, right, but when it comes to your children, right, I grant an exemption. I mean, this is absolutely plain in the text, right? I exempt you from sacrificing your first fruits. But in theory, theory, you really should
be doing it. Yeah. Now, is all this discussion of first fruits and sacrifice of first fruits, is this at all relevant to the Passover?
Well, the question then is really, what is the Passover?
Yes.
What was it? What did it become? Was the Passover sacrifice, this ritual, originally about the Exodus from Egypt?
See, I think a lot of people hear of Passover and think maybe of the crossing of the sea or something, which is certainly not what it means.
Certainly not. In fact, it probably doesn't even
12.
mean, the word, the Hebrew word Pesach, which we translate as Passover, with our lovely, pun of the holidays.
Yeah.
The holiday is called Passover because God passed over the houses of the Israelites when he smote the firstborn. The word probably doesn't even mean Passover. It probably means protect. That is, God protected the Israelites instead of...
So it's really the blood on the lentils
The blood on
is
the blood on
what
the
does
lentils.
the trick.
Right, it's an apotropaic form of protection.
But now, when we think of Passover, we think of lamb, right? Now, so you could think of this as a festival, at the time when you have the young lambs in the spring,
It's quite
and it's
possible.
a first fruits thing. Do you think that the story actually originates in the context of this story of the Exodus? Or is this a traditional observance that's fitted into the narrative at some point?
I think that, as is the case with most holidays, with most festivals, what we have is an original, perhaps agricultural, perhaps seasonal festival, or in this case, sacrificial rite, that is then sort of given a story or attached to a story. There's just to say, you could have the Exodus story perfectly well without a Passover rite being instituted at this moment.
Yeah, and of course, lots of traditional festivals originate in this way.
Indeed.
Christmas was originally a pagan festival, and midwinter and Easter, for that of it, gets a lot of its overtones from the new life and the spring. So this is, I would say, a fairly happy marriage of nature and story and the way that things are woven together.
Of course, it's not just the marriage of this, whatever Passover may have been with the story of the Exodus.
Yeah.
There is also the combination of whatever Passover is with this festival of matzot, of unleavened bread.
Now explain that one to us. I mean, I've even heard of people having unleavened bread with chocolate on it. Is this true? Is there a prescription for this in Exodus?
I don't think it's prescribed, though. It's not prescribed, but it's not proscribed either, I'm happy to say. What we have when we come to Exodus 12, which is the chapter that really goes into the Passover, is an interesting sort of back and forth of subject matter as we read through the chapter. The first few verses of the chapter, the first 13 verses, are clearly about the observance of that first night in Egypt, right, when they needed to put blood on the lentils.
Yeah.
It says nothing about observing that festival into the future. It says nothing about unleavened bread.
And so if it's a story about warding off evil, that's
right. It makes
that's
perfect sense in its context. And then in the next few verses, suddenly we are talking about a festival of unleavened bread, where you are not to eat any leavened bread for 7 days. You're only supposed to eat matzah. And no mention is made of Passover or a lamb or escape from Egypt. It's entirely looking forward, right? For all your generations, you will observe this festival of unleavened bread. And then it comes back to questions about the lamb, and then it goes back to the matzah, but really never the twain shall meet.
And all of this is the priestly source, right?
It's all from the priestly school. It looks like it may well be a number of successive hands sort of starting with the narrative and then building on it issues of how to observe this in the future.
Yeah. But explain to us, what's the deal with unleavened bread?
Well, in the narrative, right, there's the famous story of the Israelites had to flee, and they didn't have time for their bread to rise.
So you don't buy that?
No.
Yeah.
What I would say is that unleavened bread is this festival, a 7-day festival in the spring. It's almost certainly an agricultural festival originally, of which we know that there were 3. There were 3 great agricultural festivals in ancient Israel.
And now these were festivals that you were supposed to go to the temple, or to a temple.
To a temple, right? These were what we call pilgrimage festivals.
Sanctuary.
Right, they were pilgrimage festivals. They were
Yeah.
where you would go to your local sanctuary, probably, and you would have a sacrifice. Usually, I think the kind of offering where you would give some of the meat to the altar, and some of it you would have with your family, and so it was a celebratory feast before the deity. In fact, in Exodus 23, we get what I think is the oldest festival calendar. The oldest holidays that the Israelites celebrated. There are 3 of them, and they are the 3 agricultural festivals. There's the unleavened bread. There's Shavuot, which is weeks, Pentecost, and there's Sukkot, the festival of booths. They are all agricultural. They are all described in the same way. They're supposed to come before your God. You can't come empty-handed, and you are supposed to...
And, of course, in that cultic calendar in Exodus 23, there are a couple of notable absentees.
Certainly.
And the first of these, most relevant to us here, is
Passover.
The Passover. So why don't they have the Passover in Exodus 23?
Exodus 23 is explicitly a list of the 3 great pilgrimage festivals.
Yeah.
Passover, even if it was celebrated at the time that calendar was written, was not a pilgrimage festival.
So what was it then? Was it a family festival at home? Did you have to sacrifice the lamb? Or could you just...
It's an interesting question. Certainly, if sacrifice is part of it, and it becomes part of it, to be sure, if sacrifice is part of anything, it has to be done at the sanctuary. You can't sacrifice an animal at your house. You don't have an altar.
If you have a sanctuary down the road, you can run up there, slit the poor thing's throat, and bring it home and either boil it or
roast it, depending on who you ask.
Yes.
Exactly. So I think that it's quite possible that there was an idea of you sacrifice it, you slaughter it at the temple, but then it's a family event. Eventually, and this really happens in the Great Reformation we associate with the book of Deuteronomy, eventually when local sanctuaries are abolished and everyone is expected to go only to the temple in Jerusalem, now that procedure is not possible. Right? You cannot now go down the road. Right? If you're going to Jerusalem, you're going to Jerusalem. Right? You have to at least stay overnight. It's going to be something of a trek. So we see that at that point, it looks like the independent Passover sacrifice and the separate week-long pilgrimage festival of unleavened bread are fused into what we now think of as Passover, a 8-day celebration with a Passover event at the beginning, right, at the night at the beginning, and then a week where you don't eat any leaven.
Now, when this is introduced in Deuteronomy, it looks like a great novelty. Mm-hmm. Is it already presupposed here in Exodus chapter 12? Now, admittedly here we have the constraint of the fictional context. They're supposedly out in the wilderness.
That's right.
But nonetheless, they say it's the whole congregation. Well, I suppose if you think the whole congregation is tramping around in the wilderness for 40 years, it's got to be the whole congregation.
What choice do you have?
But do you figure that this is reflecting an actual practice where they would do it at the temple?
I certainly think that...
And where they would combine it with unleavened
I certainly
bread.
think by the time we get to whichever priestly hand it is that starts talking about the festival of unleavened bread in the context of that initial Passover event, I think we certainly have somebody who expects that this combination is the procedure to be done, and it's absolutely somebody who is looking beyond the strict narrative setting in a semi-anachronistic way. So you get a law about this is what you will do for all time. When you enter the land, in your dwellings, right, in your communities, when there are, what do you do with the resident alien? Right, these are concepts that would have been totally out of place in that original historical moment of that night in Egypt.
Yeah.
So yes, I think that we definitely have a broadening in Exodus 12, an assumption that Passover and matzot, unleavened bread, are already one festival that is celebrated in a temple somewhere.
But now I would think in later Jewish tradition the Passover is to a great degree the celebration of the whole Exodus.
It absolutely is.
Now, it isn't quite that here in Exodus 12 yet.
Right.
You know, you would think if they had waited until after Mount Sinai, they could have had a really good celebration.
Right. Although I think that we tend not to celebrate Mount Sinai as Jews in the same way.
Of course, there was a law attached to it.
Right. I think we feel more obligation there than we do celebration.
Yeah.
But what it says in Exodus is, right, that's where we're told, right, when you do this right, when you observe this ritual, right, you tell your child that day, this is because of what God did for me and for us when He took us out of Egypt. So it does encompass, you know, it's a climactic last moment, almost last moment, but it stands in for the entire event.